Kurt adjusted the unevenly lying pancake with 2 fingers, not even suspecting that tomorrow at this time he would not have either these fingers or his hand. And hardly any one of us can know in advance that tomorrow we will have to cut off our arm to survive. Now Kurt was thinking only about today's date. It was a girl he didn't even dare to dream of, attractive, smart, well-groomed. She radiated an aura of femininity and family, and Kurt felt his heart melt just like this piece of butter on his frying pan. He was making pancakes in his kitchen, but all his thoughts were only about Milana. Kurt had just moved to Los Angeles and worked 12 hours a day on a promising startup that was preparing for release, and in case of success Kurt could count on a share in the project. As a result, Kurt's personal life was reduced to coding and gym, as it was before this project the man had been lonely for several years. Natural shyness and excessive honesty prevented Kurt from flirting and dating. Kurt registered on Tinder, trying with the last of his strength to gather in his heart the fragments of hope for a miracle and to meet someone there with serious intentions. And then the miracle happened. Milana appeared, a non-smoking educated brunette in a black dress with a spiritual dreamy self-description, with natural makeup, without a tendency to drugs and alcoholism, but with a desire to have children in the future. In general, that's exactly how he imagined his ideal. Kurt continued to fry pancakes, imagining how he would bring Milana to meet his parents in his hometown of Vienna. He would show her this beautiful ancient city, tell her a couple of scary stories from its past, so that she, listening, would be a little scared and cuddled up to him. Of course, meeting the parents is a serious step, but what's the point of wasting time on hopeless relationships? After all, he is almost 40 years old. As if reading his thoughts, the phone rang. It was his mother. Kurt picked up the phone, but nothing was heard. He called his mother several times, but there was only some rustling in the receiver. Then she finally answered, as if surprised that he could hear her. She had a bad dream about him, about Kurt. She dreamed that he was hanging over an abyss, and somewhere below, under his feet, behind a thick fog, something fierce and eternally hungry was hiding, and this thing was waiting for his blood. Kurt sighed and began to calm his mother, saying that it was just her worries and it was not worth watching the series until night. It was bad for her psyche. His mother just sighed sadly and said that she had to go. Kurt promised to call her tomorrow, but she answered, "I won't be here tomorrow." There were some very sad notes in her voice, but Kurt was too excited about the date and missed it by the ears, thinking that his mother was just going to go somewhere in the mountains tomorrow, where there would be no connection. They said goodbye and he hung up the phone. Getting ready for the date, Kurt was nervous like a schoolboy who goes to the first day after the holidays to a new school. They met in Griffith Park. Walking around the park, they carelessly chatted about this and that, remembered some funny stories from life, shared thoughts, immediately felt some contact, spark, and all this was insanely liked by Kurt. In the restaurant everything also went well, many of their life values coincided, and this inspired him to think that there might be something serious between them. He hadn't felt so alive in a long time. Milana's car was being repaired and a friend had driven her to the park, so she asked Kurt to drive her home. Already in front of her house, they sat in his car and were kissing like a couple of teenagers. Suddenly, she interrupted their kisses and offered him a peppermint candy. Kurt instantly flashed with embarrassment, but Milana calmed him down by saying that she just liked the taste of peppermint. He pulled out a pack of lifesavers, but Milana leaned on his lap and nimbly snatched the candy out of his hand with her lips, running her tongue over his fingers a little. "That's mine," she said with a laugh. "And I'll give you mine." She pulled a nearly empty package of lollipops out of her purse. Kurt hadn't seen these before. Milana shook out the last candy and said, "Oh, the last one. We're helping a client market these lollipops and everyone at work is already eating them. Try one, they're great." Leaning one hand on Kurt's strong chest, she playfully held out the candy to him and he took it in his mouth, repeating with his tongue all the moves Milana had made with his candy. The candy had a strange medicinal flavor. She began kissing Kurt's neck, and after a minute she suggested that they go to her place. Milana justified that this was all new to her, that she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to feel the way she felt now, but she knew one thing for sure: she didn't want to waste another minute and wanted to devote as much of her time to Kurt as possible, so she didn't mind if he came over for another glass of wine or a cup of coffee. Kurt might have taken her suggestion differently, but after the situation with the lollipop, he suddenly trusted Milana even more, and they held hands and walked into her house. Milana bounced and laughed like a teenage girl. She turned on the night light, which barely made out the silhouettes of the objects in the house. Kurt watched her like a mesmerized man, oblivious to the fact that the house she lived in was completely impersonal. There were no pictures on the walls, no flowers, no trinkets, just cold, indifferent walls and empty furniture. Passion and desire burned in his chest, and these feelings enveloped him in some sweet, sticky treacle from which it was impossible to get out. The shadows on all sides were pulling their tentacles toward Kurt. His heart pounded, sweat beaded on his forehead, and a sense of unreality gradually filled his consciousness. Milana, pouring red wine into her glass, looked directly into Kurt's eyes. "Come, I'll show you something," she said, "but first let's drink to us." She watched Kurt drink the wine. The wine had a strange taste, like rusty iron, as if blood had been diluted in it, though it might have been the residual flavor of a lollipop. It seemed to Kurt that the walls were shifting, pressing against him. The light was too bright and cold, and the shadows were much darker than they should be. It seemed that instead of shadows everywhere, there were just black gaps into otherworldly dimensions from which thousands of beings were watching him intently. Some faint whispering came from behind Kurt, even though no one was there. Kurt squeezed the skin on the bridge of his nose and rubbed his eyes to regain his composure. He thought he had too much to drink, but a nearly extinct inner voice tried to tell him that he hadn't and that he was in danger, but it was too late. Milana gestured for him to come to the bedroom. When he entered, he saw her sitting on the bed, slowly removing her pantyhose, exposing her perfectly smooth legs. He stood still, as if bewitched, unable to move, and this seemed strange to him. For the last 10 minutes, he had only done what she ordered him to do. The shadows continued to thicken. Kurt felt every drop of sweat on his body and the growing sense of anxiety. Meanwhile, Milana had completely taken off her upper clothes, leaving only her corset, but it was clear from her movements that she had not finished her ritual. With a confident and familiar motion, she took off her wig, exposing her pale, bald, two-round head in the cold light from the window. Then she took off her eyelashes, and suddenly, after the eyelashes, she peeled off her eyelids, first the upper ones, then the lower ones, exposing perfectly round eyeballs that pierced Kurt with a predatory mad look. After the eyelids, the ears followed, then the nose, then the breasts, which peeled off her body with a strange squelching sound. Milana was removing parts of her body and putting them in an old stone box on which some figures were carved. For a moment, Kurt focused and saw that the box had scenes of sacrifice carved on it. Kurt looked further around the room and only now noticed the gnawed bones lying on the floor, and in the corner a strange altar on which some dark liquid was spilled, apparently blood. But without Milana's command, he was unable to move, and this state scared him even more than what was happening around. Meanwhile, Milana tore off her lips and cheeks from her face, exposing a huge long mouth, from which 2 even rows of sharp as a palisade small, long and curved inward teeth protruded. It seemed she had no less than 50 of them. There was a click of the corset clasp, and Milana's huge bluish belly, consisting of several gelatinous folds of fat, fell on the bed. Now she looked more like a giant oily maggot with long bony arms and skinny legs, and her fingers with sharpened nails seemed to be twice as long as a human's. She beckoned Kurt with her finger. "Come on, don't you like me?" She had a squeaky, shrill voice, and when she spoke, some thick yellow saliva dripped from her teeth. Kurt backed away, but suddenly the maggot jumped off the bed, leaped at him, and hit him hard on both ears with her hands. Kurt passed out. From the unconscious darkness, he felt something touching his face. Kurt began to regain consciousness. A fly was crawling on his face, his hands were tied behind his back and hurt in his shoulders. He opened his eyes. He was in some basement, tied to a load-bearing column. On the left, logs were burning in the fireplace, and on the right, on the table, was the corpse of a young man. His chest was cut open, and next to him were tools for working with several saws, chisels, a hammer. The corpse was tied to the table with barbed wire and tape. It was very quiet. The guy's face seemed very familiar, but Kurt had trouble focusing on him. His brain refused to understand anything. Kurt felt like a vegetable. A couple more of his fly friends joined the one on his face. They quickly crawled on his skin with their small hard and sticky legs and did not fly away. The walls twitched and flickered as if Kurt was watching some glitch video from the 90s. Somewhere upstairs, there was an unintelligible speech in a language he did not understand. The voices were getting closer to the basement when suddenly the corpse slowly turned its head to Kurt. Its empty, unblinking gaze was directed straight into his eyes. It seemed to see Kurt's very soul. The skin on the neck gathered in unnatural folds, and a dark liquid gathered in the corner of the corpse's mouth, which slightly spread over the cracked, dried lips and slowly dripped down. The corpse opened its black lips, hissed, run, and froze. The door to the basement swung open and Milana entered. She no longer looked like a maggot, but there was little left of her former self. She walked up to Kurt and gently tousled his hair. "Are you awake? You were out of your mind and I had to tie you up. You attacked me and hurt me very much. Don't you want to apologize?" She stood in front of him, spinning and playfully biting the edge of her shirt, which barely fit on her body, with her long teeth. In the gaps between the buttons, Kurt saw her smooth, shiny skin, under which dark organs floating inside moved with every movement. Kurt tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. He started to choke and wheeze. It seemed to him that the fly that crawled on his face had crawled into his lungs and was now crawling there. He tried to spit out the fly with strong exhalations. After a second, there were 2, 3, 10 flies in his lungs, and Kurt clearly felt that they completely filled him and quickly crawled inside his lungs. Milana, seeing that something was wrong with him, slapped him in the face. The feeling of a swarm of flies disappeared. Everything around seemed more real. It seemed that some kind of hypnosis had fallen from Kurt. Milana became herself again, but Kurt was still tied to the column, and the corpse of a familiar man, whose name Kurt could not remember, also stared at him intently. Milana noticed that Kurt was looking at the body. "Oh, don't mind, this is my ex," she waved her hand. "He didn't appreciate me at all, not like you." Milana coquettishly shrugged her shoulders and pressed herself to Kurt. "You are a real gentleman, you will not hurt me anymore." Rage and despair squeezed Kurt's heart, his jaws moved on his cheekbones. "Oh, how angry we are," Milana laughed psychopathically and took out her signature mint candy. Kurt began to shake his head, not letting her shove the candy into his mouth, but Milana firmly grabbed him by the throat under his lower jaw with her long, strong fingers and pressed hard below his ears. Kurt's jaw opened, pain paralyzed his movements, and either he was too weak or Milana was an inhumanly strong creature. She pushed the candy into his mouth and pinched Kurt's nose so he couldn't breathe. Kurt panicked for 10 seconds and still swallowed the candy. "Good boy, you are such a good boy," Milana said in a soft, approving tone and kissed him on the cheek. "Come to your senses and we'll talk." She started to climb the stairs to the door, and the shadow behind her grew bigger and bigger with every step, taking up all the space, and when she closed the door, the darkness closed and Kurt plunged into a black, viscous silence. After a moment, he heard the noise of the TV. He was lying in bed and felt the warmth of another human body next to him. He opened his eyes. Next to him in his arms lay Malina, and some kind of horror movie was on TV. "Oh, you woke up," she said and pressed closer to him. "We watched a horror movie, and you fell asleep, but you tossed and turned. Probably a bad dream?" Milana looked sympathetically into his eyes with her unblinking direct gaze. Kurt looked at her carefully, but there were no signs of a maggot or false eyelids or ears. He wanted to get up and go on to come to his senses, but some kind of inner laziness spread throughout his body, pulsed in his veins, enveloped his brain, and he again felt that moment when he was an obedient, will-less vegetable that does everything that Milana says. Although somewhere inside he still hoped that it was all really a bad dream and he imagined it. Not letting him come to his senses, Milana asked him to get up and bring her the remote control from the TV. A moment ago, drowned in a feeling of laziness, Kurt suddenly jumped off the bed like a spring and happily brought the remote to Milana. She switched the channel to some documentary about mantises, gave the remote to Kurt and asked him to put it in place. As soon as he returned to bed, she came to her senses and said that she had already seen this documentary and asked him to bring the remote again. Kurt, feeling some kind of dog joy, instantly rushed for the remote and brought it to Milana, like a hunting dog brings a duck in his mouth to his owner. Milana switched to the news channel and casually threw the remote on the floor, ordering Kurt to clean it up. A tiny part of his consciousness was outraged for a moment, but the rest of his inner self was unconditionally ready to obey Milana. He put the remote control in place. A smug, arrogant smile flashed across Milana's face. She enjoyed her domination. Milana began to praise what a good fellow he was and how lucky she was with him, because he was so polite and courteous, and she valued Kurt more than anything for his openness and lack of secrets. Kurt stupidly looked at the TV screen. These were some news, but the feeling of dullness so captured his consciousness that he could not even understand what was happening on the screen. The brain worked with a delay, like in an online game with high ping. Milana took his laptop out of the bedside table. Kurt indifferently watched as she opened his laptop, and he did not even have any questions how his thing got here, why she needed it, and even more, how she was able to unlock his laptop. Kurt's attention was increasingly drawn to the frame from the news. Some politician was speaking on the stage, and different people stood behind him. One of them somehow differed greatly from the rest. Milana handed the laptop to Kurt. "You said you were working on some very complex code. I admire your intellect, it's so sexy. Can you log into the server and show me?" Kurt's hands involuntarily jerked to the laptop to fulfill Milana's request, but his gaze was riveted to the TV. The politician continued to talk about the fact that emissions into the atmosphere are too high, but that strange man from the crowd seemed to look through the screen directly at Kurt. The man opened his mouth and Kurt recognized him. It was the corpse from the basement. The man on the screen whispered again, "Don't do it." Kurt froze. "Hey," Milana poked Kurt with a laptop. Her gaze was direct, unblinking, completely inhuman, rather like a snake looking at its prey. "Give me access to the server." Suddenly, the TV show was interrupted and there was only interference on the screen. It seemed that Milana did not notice it at all. Kurt's hands uncontrollably lay on the keyboard, ready to open access to the server, when suddenly the TV shows began to switch one after another, faster and faster, plunging Kurt into a pre-epileptic state. Milana did not react and seemed not to see the TV, she just looked at Kurt. Flashes of light slid across her face. Suddenly, some romantic series appeared on the screen, which captured all of Kurt's attention. It seemed that the TV approached him closely, capturing all the visible space, as if bending around Kurt, while the rest of the world plunged into complete darkness. Kurt saw only what was happening on the screen. He felt saliva dripping from his mouth. He could not move either his hand or his foot. The only thing that moved was his eyes. Somewhere from afar, Milana's voice sounded. She muttered something dissatisfied and seemed to be talking to someone on the phone. Kurt turned his gaze towards Milana and saw that next to him lay the same naked maggot with sharp teeth and bony long arms. The maggot rubbed his bare leg against Kurt, and her body made gurgling sounds, similar to shaking a bottle of smoothie. Kurt tried to scream, to move away, but his body did not obey and he could only squeeze out of himself an unintelligible moaning. Meanwhile, the maggot pointed to the main character in the movie and noticed that he was disrespectful to the main heroine of the series, and it annoyed her. Then she said that since Kurt showed with his moaning that he agreed with such a disgusting attitude towards the poor girl, she, Milana, would now cut off one finger for each mistake of the main character. She took out a garden pruner, took Kurt's limp hand and bit off his little finger. A sharp pain pierced Kurt. He tried to scream again, but could not, as if he had a gag or some other object in his mouth. His mouth was filled with the taste of blood. Blood splashed from the mutilated hand onto the bed. "Ugh, how rude of you. You stained the bed. I'll have to wash again, and I don't forgive that," Milana said and cut off another finger. Groans and sobs shook Kurt's chest. His mouth was full of some kind of dough. It seemed his tongue was swollen. Milana instantly changed her rhetoric. "Oh, poor thing, you got dirty." She started to bandage his hand with a t-shirt. Quiet, quiet, everything is fine. "You know, in my homeland there is such an expression. When someone is injured and needs to be calmed down, we say it will heal before the wedding." The maggot snickered disgustingly, covering his giant toothy mouth with a bloody hand. Suddenly she paid attention to the series again. The main heroine was crying because her boyfriend gave her the wrong gift that she wanted. "Why can't all men properly court a woman?" asked Milana and, inserting another finger of Kurt into the pruner, briskly pressed. The finger flew to the side and fell to the floor. Kurt moaned, but could not move. He was completely paralyzed. He watched as the blood flowed from his hand to the floor, listened as Milana laughed, who was clearly a crazy psychopath, and after a few moments he lost consciousness. There was still a metallic taste in his mouth. Kurt woke up. He was tied to a chair in the kitchen, with a gag in his mouth. He looked at his blurred reflection in the huge refrigerator door. It seemed that his whole face was smeared with blood. His hands were bandaged with makeshift means. Somewhere he could see the edge of some cotton. Blood seeped through the fabric. Kurt felt nauseous. Milana leaned over him. She was again in the image of a human. "Hey, do you realize that you're not right in the head?" she said. "You really scare me. Instead of just doing what you're supposed to do, you fall into madness again. This time you bit off your own fingers, some of them you even swallowed." Kurt shook his head negatively, clearly remembering how the maggot cut off his fingers, but among the horrifyingly gloomy memories there was one, where he, sitting in front of his laptop, repeats what the man on the TV screen said, "Don't do it," and then puts his hand in his mouth and actually bites off a finger. Was it real, or did Milana get into his head, and plant all these horrors in his consciousness, and now he sees only what she wants? He didn't understand. Kurt's eyes were drawn to his laptop standing on the kitchen table. It had a page open to access the server where he uploaded all his code. He looked questioningly at Milana. She sat on the table next to the laptop and, waving her hand in a mannered way, began to explain. "Oh, come on. You praised your talent so much that I couldn't resist and just decided to look at your code. Just log into the server, and as a reward I'll take you to the ER. And it will all end. Well, do you agree?" She quickly jumped off the table and pulled the gag out of Kurt's mouth. "Who? What are you?" Kurt tried to speak, but he had a hard time. "Do you really care so much what I am right now?" Milana asked in a sepulchral voice, twisting her cute face and parodying a monster, and then laughed merrily, twirling a strand of her hair on her finger. "So what? Will you show me the code? Or shall we continue?" Kurt shook his head negatively. Milana approached him and, using the same method as before, forcibly fed him a lollipop. Then she splashed water in his face and untied him. Kurt continued to sit like a rag doll, motionless, listless, indifferent. A feeling of pain, loneliness, and despair overwhelmed him. Unable to cope with it, he cried. They put a laptop on the table in front of him. The login procedure was complex, with overcoming several barriers of protection. He entered his login, started typing the password, which was only the first line of access, when suddenly Kurt coughed and a clotted lump of blood flew out of his throat, flew across the kitchen and slapped in the middle of the perfectly washed floor. The lump had a strange shape, there was something hypnotic in it, and Kurt hung for a moment. Then he looked at Milana, and suddenly there was no one where she had just been. He was alone in the kitchen. There was a piercing, deafening silence. Outside the window was darkness, only some vague dark shapes flitted in front of the windows. They looked like giant bacteria, which fussed and pushed in some dark jelly and ate each other. The walls began to shift with a creaking metallic sound, like when a submarine sinks to the bottom. The kitchen became cramped, the air heated up, and it was hard to breathe. Kurt felt like the only being in the entire universe in a small stuffy box, which was thrown to the bottom of the ocean. It lasted, maybe a moment, or maybe an eternity. Kurt lost the ability to feel time. He was suddenly torn out of his stupor by a loud, sharp, ringing sound like a whip crack, made by the oven, which indicated that the food was ready. Kurt got up, walked over to the oven and opened it. Inside the oven it was dark, but it was visible that something was baking on the baking sheet. Steam hit his face. It smelled like some too sour barbecue. He took a potholder and pulled out the heavy tray with one motion. On it was a baked human leg. Kurt felt dizzy with disgust. He backed away from the oven and leaned on a chair. Behind him, thin, bony, pale hands slowly hugged him. It was Milana again. Her sharp nails went through his shirt and dug into his skin, not letting him move, like needles of some medieval torture device. "It's so romantic, cooking together," Milana croaked in a hoarse voice over his ear. "Try a piece." She pushed him to the tray with unexpected force. He tried to push himself away from the table, but he didn't have enough strength. The creature was stronger. Suddenly he felt nauseous. "If you throw up, I'll make you eat your own leg," Milana said. He didn't see her, but he felt her heavy breathing on the back of his neck, smelling of rotten fish. Milana continued, "I don't need your dirt here. I washed the kitchen all day yesterday for you. Have some respect for me and my work. I'm not your housewife." Despite the threats, Kurt threw up. He turned around and hit the maggot in the part where her head was guessed. Then he, barely holding onto his weakened legs, ran into the corridor, holding onto the walls. He was caught up by a strong blow in the back and he fell. The worm grabbed him by the heel and dragged him along the corridor. Kurt tried to grab the floor, the walls, but only more blood came out on his bandaged hands. The worm dragged him to the basement. Kurt hit his head on the first step and passed out again. He woke up sitting on the couch in the basement. In front of him on his knees was a laptop. There was no body on the table, only a dark stain reminded that someone was killed and dissected here. Who was he? One specific old memory of this man was spinning in Kurt's mind, but every time he approached it, it slipped away, leaving behind only a barely perceptible trail of some images. A pair of coals smoldered in the fireplace. Had it been so little time? Kurt felt like he had been here for more than a week, but if it was the same coals in the fireplace, then it had been no more than 2 hours. "Hey," Milana snapped her fingers in front of his face. "What about the token?" Kurt lowered his gaze to the laptop screen, which was on his knees. He had already entered his login and password, and now he had to use the token. Next to Kurt on the couch lay an empty wrapper from a lollipop. Kurt's mouth, living its own life, said slowly and quietly, "It is encrypted under another file. It needs to be decrypted." "Well, so do it," Milana ordered rudely with the pressure of a street robber. She sat opposite in black jeans and a t-shirt, spreading her legs wide and resting her elbows resting on her knees. Her hair was disheveled, and there was a bruise under her eye. Milana had strong, sinewy arms. Her muscles were like carved by a sculptor from stone, and it was noticeable that she worked out in the gym at least once a day. Milana noticed his gaze and fell into her usual psychopathic aggressive state. "You think that women are so weak, but you are wrong. We despise persons like you, rich sons, bespectacled nerds, for whom everything in life is given without effort." She grabbed him by the hair and hit his head against her chair with all her might. Kurt couldn't understand what was happening, another crazy hallucination or a horrifying reality, but the pain felt very real. Blood from his cut eyebrow flooded his left eye and he could now only see with his right. Milana pushed him onto the couch and took a dominant position. "So, you can't fight back now?" she shouted defiantly. "Yes, now you know that you can't hit a woman. But I can hit you." She started to kick Kurt in the head and groin with her boots. He tried to cover himself with his hands. All his muscles trembled, like withered leaves on a strong autumn wind, and he could barely move. "This will end when you finish the job," she yelled and stepped back. She took the laptop and ran upstairs, leaving Kurt alone on the floor in the basement. Kurt spat out blood along with a knocked-out tooth. It became quiet. Only behind his back Kurt heard some rhythmic creaking. He just lay there and listened to the creaking. At some point he thought he also heard panting. By the tone he thought it was a child. He turned around. No one, only on the floor there was some strange homemade doll the size of a 3-year-old child. Kurt struggled to get up and approach the doll. To his horror, it was sewn from fragments of flesh and skin, with small bones sticking out somewhere. The doll was dressed in a small gray from dirt-torn dress. Suddenly the doll opened human eyes and stared at him. "Do not tell them the code," the doll whispered, "then they will kill us." Kurt recoiled from the doll to the other side of the sofa, but when he looked again, it seemed to dissolve. He heard a rustling behind him. Sure that it was the doll, Kurt turned around. Before him stood his mother. She had tears in her eyes. She reached out to him and whispered, "Run, my son, my angel." Surprised, Kurt staggered and fell on the couch, but the ghost of his mother had already disappeared. He slowly got up and walked to the place where he had just seen his mom. The vision was too realistic. The door to the basement opened and Milana came in. She was in a dress for some reason. She stood in the doorway, holding the hem of her dress, and twirled coquettishly. "Well, do you like it? We're going on a date now. I hope this time you'll tell me everything about your work, and of course, show me." She started to go down the stairs, when suddenly her face twisted into a horrible grimace of hatred. She literally jumped at Kurt with one giant leap, like a hungry angry lynx, and grabbed him by the chest. "Do you have another one?" She growled like a wild beast, rolling her eyes. Her lips were twisted, saliva flew from her mouth in all directions, a knife appeared in her hand. "I can feel it. You weren't thinking about me just now." "Who is she?" "I'll kill that scum. Right here." She stood exactly in the place where Kurt had just seen the ghost of his mother, spinning in place and looking like a predator who had lost the trail of its prey during a chase in the forest. As if by a click, her face changed expression from animal bloodlust to a cute silly girl. Kurt was amazed at how she could transform so quickly in less than a second. "Okay, I'll forgive you this time," she said, putting the knife to Kurt's stomach. He felt too weak to resist. Playing a playful little girl again, Milana explained, "After all, we're going on a date." "Lollipop?" Before Kurt tried to react somehow, she swiftly punched him in the liver and then in the legs. Kurt fell to his knees and Milana put the knife to his throat. Kurt took the lollipop and washed it down with some strangely smelling bitter liquid, which also looked like some kind of medicine. It seemed that his kidnappers had started to improvise, which meant that everything that was happening did not fit into their plan and there was some possibility that he would be able to escape. Before his eyes everything blurred with bright colors, a flash of light, and Kurt was already sitting on a bench on the terrace behind the house. It was easy, bright and warm, flowers hung in pots, a clear blue sky stretched out right in front of him, and next to him was a bottle of expensive wine and two glasses, one of which had traces of bright red lipstick. For some reason, this scene reminded Kurt of one of his dreams, in which he dreamed that he met his wife. "So, you're a programmer?" asked the beautiful and charming girl sitting next to him. She seemed to be called Milana. "What are you working on now?" Kurt, as if forgetting everything that had happened, was simply pleased that someone was interested in his work. He felt like he was in a new reality, and all his other life was left in that other, bad reality, as if it was some kind of movie that he had seen a long time ago and almost forgot. Kurt was filled with a sense of pride for his work. He did not like to boast, but now he really wanted to show everything that he had done. After all, it could revolutionize the cryptography industry. He started to tell her about his work and how he wrote the code. "Oh, how interesting," said Milana, smiling sweetly. "Can you show me?" Between them on the bench, as if by magic, his laptop appeared. Entering the password in the decryptor, Kurt felt that it was somehow difficult for him to press the keys. For a moment he thought that he did not have enough fingers. But pressing the buttons is easy, and when you type fast, the keyboard clicks pleasantly under your fingers, but only if it lies flat on the table, because when something gets under the keyboard, it loses stability and hits the surface of the table, and that annoys. A sudden memory softly filled Kurt's memory. He was still in Vienna then and was just having an online interview with his current company. It was one of those multi-level interviews when you have to prove to a whole bunch of different managers that you are capable of doing basic things. All the interviews were online. At one of those interviews, the interviewer's edge of the keyboard got on some report and his keyboard clattered on the table every time he typed something on his computer. Probably that's why Kurt didn't remember his face so well, but now he was sure and could swear that this man was the same man whose body he had seen earlier in the basement, and it was he who told him from the TV, "Don't do this." Kurt's memory stopped, as if someone had pressed pause, and the man looked Kurt straight in the eye. Then the man shook his head negatively and said, "This is too important to treat security so lightly." He was a security officer. The memory crumpled, fell apart, and was replaced by another image, the corpse of the security officer on the table looking straight into Kurt's eyes. Kurt felt a wave of horror rising somewhere in the depths of his consciousness. It grew, rose, and moved towards him. The wave was getting faster and faster. The wave was rushing, sweeping away all other emotions and sensations on its way. This horror completely engulfed Kurt, and he realized that he was sitting on a dirty, dilapidated terrace where there was some dim lantern with broken glass, and next to him was a completely unpredictable psychopath with a clearly expressed hatred of men who was hired to get access to the server and who would not stop at anything to achieve her goal. In front of him was an open laptop, and he had almost finished decrypting the token, which was necessary for access to the server, where not only his code was located, but also you could get access to many developments of the company. Kurt slams the laptop shut. Milana flinches from the surprise and bats her long eyelashes. Kurt turns to her and says, "Let's make a deal." Milana gives him a condescending smile, nods and replies, "Let's do it, here's my offer." The next moment Kurt feels her fist breaking his jaw and he passes out again. He woke up on the basement floor, in complete confusion, not knowing how much time had passed. His jaw hurt a lot. It seemed that he would not get out alive, even if they opened access to the server. Moreover, as soon as he does that, they will kill him right away. The only option was either to hold on until the end and wait for them to make a mistake, or to deprive them of that opportunity and end it all himself, here and now. Kurt was already ready to look for something that he could use for this purpose, but then he noticed that there was a small window under the ceiling. Trying not to make noise, he put a chair to the window. The frame opened. The dimensions were narrow, but you could squeeze through. Clinging with his mutilated hands, Kurt tried to pull himself up. His muscles hummed like ropes holding ships at the pier in a storm. He somehow managed to stick his head out of the window. The window overlooked a fenced-in courtyard. Writhing like a worm, Kurt continued to squeeze through the window little by little. It was getting light outside. It was cold. When Kurt, clinging with his remaining fingers to the dirt and grass, crawled out almost to the waist, he was almost out of breath and looked a little higher and saw the neighbor's house behind the fence. Some old man was watching him warily from the window of the second floor of his house. Kurt looked at him with one eye. He could not open the other one because of the dry blood. Kurt folded his hands in a pleading gesture and then brought his hand to his ear, like a phone receiver. The old man nodded his head. Suddenly there was a dull growl nearby. 2 pit bulls were approaching Kurt. Kurt panicked and started to shove himself back into the basement, but because he moved a little sharply, the dogs pounced on him and began to tear and bite. Covering his face with his hands and screaming in pain, Kurt fell back into the basement, dragging both dogs with him, who clung to him with a death grip. As he fell, he felt himself flipping in the air and falling down right on the dogs. There was a crunch of bones and a whimper. Milana ran in. She started to scream in panic. Her voice sounded some pain and sorrow. Kurt lay on the floor, closing his eyes and pretending to be unconscious again, feeling one of the dogs twitching convulsively next to him. Milana continued to scream something in some unknown language and approached him. The dog kept twitching, and the other one whimpered quietly. Kurt felt Milana lean over him and twist the wounded dog's neck with one sharp movement. It stopped twitching. Kurt lay motionless. Somewhere deep in his soul, he already didn't care much whether he would survive or not. He felt blood flowing out of his wounds from the dog bites with every beat of his heart. Kurt heard someone very big come down to the basement. His heavy steps echoed in Kurt's head. Most likely the thug weighed about 200 pounds. Milana ordered something in the same language and Kurt felt a prick in his neck. Falling asleep, he felt himself being carried somewhere. In a half-sleep, he realized that they were stitching up his wounds. On his arms, on his back. The needle went in and out of his skin. Up, down. 1, 2. Tie a knot. And again from the beginning. There was no pain, just a feeling of pressure from the needle and how it passed through the flesh. "You know, my dogs were hurt," he heard Milana's voice. She clearly understood that he had already woken up. "And what's worse, it hurt me. You did a very bad thing." Kurt was afraid to open his eyes, and he hoped that everything that was happening was another surreal hallucination. "Don't you dare look at me." Milana continued her psychopathic monologue, stitching up Kurt's scars. "And rightly so. You, men, don't understand at all how often we are hurt, and it's your fault." Milana shouted the last phrase loudly, clearly separating the words with pauses, but her hand didn't even flinch. Milana's voice regained its normal tone. That's why I'm the best for this job. But you're so stupid, you don't let me do my work properly. I always have to start over with you. Who knew that you had such side effects from the drug? Your brain reacts strangely to it. Do you hear me, you moron? You should have opened access to the server a long time ago and all this would have ended. But no, we move slowly, but we move. I'm patient. I can endure humiliation, injustice, blood, and pain. Suddenly Milana giggled, clearly thinking of something that she found very funny. And really, what if you felt like a woman at least a little? Do you want to know what periods are like? The cold, sharp tip of the scalpel passed through his jeans and pressed against Kurt's crotch. He shuddered in surprise, opened his eyes, and rolled his head back. Milana continued to giggle and put a little pressure on the scalpel. A bloody stain began to appear on Kurt's jeans. He began to scream and began to gasp for air. A sharp, displeased, low cry, more like the grunting of a giant pig, rang out. Milana swiftly removed the scalpel and in an apologetic tone of a little girl who was caught cheating on her homework, she started to say something in her language as if she was excusing herself. The irritated grunting repeated. It seemed that it was her 200-foot partner. He growled something and also walked heavily out of the room. Kurt could not see him, he only heard these very heavy steps. Well, okay, the main thing is that you understood my idea, Milana said in a cheerful and playful voice, as if she was playing some game with friends. Now I'll put a tampon on you and give you some painkillers. Everything is like us, everything is fair. Open wide, here comes this spoonful of pie. Kurt was in a lot of pain and he eagerly swallowed 2 painkillers, but after a second he realized that the second pill was another candy. You're such a simpleton, God, how did they even hire you? Milana laughed, then leaned over to Kurt's ear and whispered. And you know, we should also deliver your baby, so that there is full equality and you know, something tells me that you will have a cesarean. She playfully ran her nail with a perfect manicure over his stomach. Kurt groaned and turned his head. He was in the living room. They laid him on the table and tied him with tape. He turned his head to the side and saw the severed head of the neighbor on the table near the entrance, the old man who Kurt asked to call 911. Next to it was a bag with carpenter's tools. It was covered in blood. Unable to look, Kurt turned his head to the other side. In front of him was a pink baby carriage. It was all so clean, cute, with ruffles, hearts and kittens. Very sweet and pretty, reminiscent of a marshmallow. It looked so contrasted to what was happening that Kurt thought it was another hallucination. There was someone in the carriage. Kurt was ready to think that it was the stitched-up flesh kid. And this could have been our baby, if you hadn't spoiled the date, Milana said and pulled back the curtain. Inside was one of the pit bulls, his paws were bandaged. Milana leaned over to him and started to chatter like a little child. Cutie pie, my little joy, Mommy's daughter got sick, Mommy's beauty. She kissed the dog right on the lips and turned to Kurt. Apologize, right now. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, Kurt whispered with difficulty. Milana nodded, understanding that the drug was taking effect and cut the tape with a scalpel. Kurt sat on the table, his body hardly hurt. Apparently the painkillers worked. There was a laptop in front of him. Milana looked at the clock and twirled her index finger in the air. Time is not rubber, come on, don't slow down, log onto the server. Kurt obeyed, although he felt that something had changed this time. Kurt felt the need to obey, but it was not as pronounced as it was last time. Maybe the painkillers suppressed the effect of the drug. There was some tension in the air. Kurt moved slowly, trying to catch if he had this addiction and fanatic desire to fulfill all of Milana's orders. Suddenly the chandelier above them started to flicker, and this time it was not a hallucination. Milana jerked up and looked attentively at the chandelier. It felt like somewhere there was a short circuit. In the corridor, right behind the door, there was a scrape. Clearly someone ran their nails along the wooden surface of the door. There was a quiet sigh, apparently female, but it was not Milana. She jumped off her seat, grabbed a knife and bared her teeth like a predator and opened the door to the empty corridor with all her strength. Realizing that this was his only chance, Kurt bent down to the carpenter's bag as quickly as he could and grabbed the handle of some tool. He was lucky it was a carpenter's hammer. He rushed to Milana, while she looked bewilderedly into the dark emptiness of the corridor and did not notice him, apparently thinking that he was under the influence of the drug. Suddenly the flashes stopped, as if giving Kurt a chance to see his target better. Kurt struck one blow after another, suppressing a storm of emotions in his chest of a person who had never killed and avoided any violence all his life. Milana was already on the floor, face down, but Kurt continued to hit. Blood and pieces of bones flew in different directions. Kurt stopped, shocked by what he had to do. Milana's body lay on the floor right under him. Her head was turned to the side and Kurt could see her face. Strangely, it seemed that only now her face finally acquired some inner peace and no longer expressed one of her two favorite emotions, either relentless malice or playful coquetry of a teenage girl. Now she looked like an ordinary person, not an unbalanced psychopath, and for some reason Kurt felt unbearably painful from the realization that despite everything, she was still a human being, albeit one who was clearly capable of torture and mass murder. He tried to catch his breath for a few moments. His heart was pounding in his chest. Realizing that he had to run, he began to quietly move along the corridor to the front door. He heard, as at the other end of the house, on the stairs, the same heavy steps of Milana's partner rattled. His grunting exclamations were heard. It seemed he called Milana. Kurt opened the door and ran to the high fence. The code lock on the gates could not be opened and he began to try to climb over the fence. He managed to climb onto the fence itself and only had to throw the second leg. The heavyweight just grabbed him by that leg and, as if Kurt was half an empty bag of peanuts, tore Kurt off the fence. Making an arc in the air, Kurt hit the ground with great force. It was heard how his ribs cracked. Pain hit the brain, although maybe not so much. The painkillers still worked. Milana's partner twisted Kurt's arms behind his back. Both his wrists fit in one palm of the grunting criminal. He drove Kurt into the house and dragged him into the basement. In the corridor, Kurt saw a spreading bloodstain from Milana's body, and now this sight did not cause any emotions in him. He did not care. From the push of the heavyweight, he touched the bloodstain and slipped a little on the parquet, from which he received another strong push in the back. Kurt never managed to see the face of the kidnapper. The only thing he noticed was small, sticking out to the sides and damaged ears, like wrestlers, only there was a feeling that he also cut off half of each ear. In the basement, the criminal shackled Kurt's hands with handcuffs behind a vertical pipe that ran from the basement to the upper floors and began to look for something in the box, turning his back to Kurt. Kurt saw how he found some tool. The big guy straightened up, his shoulders straightened to the sides. For a moment he thought, as if making some decision, but then he grunted evilly and jerked his hand. The sound of a gasoline engine rang out. A cloud of gray smoke flew up from behind the kidnapper's figure. It was an old handheld chainsaw. The heavyweight turned sharply. Under the overhanging eyebrows like a pithecanthropus, his small eyes like a piglet were visible. He drilled Kurt with a look and moved his huge heavy jaw from side to side, as if chewing some invisible piece of food. Then, apparently deciding finally that their mission had failed and now it was worth both taking revenge and getting rid of the witnesses. Continuing to grunt something unintelligibly, he took a step towards Kurt. Suddenly the lamp on the ceiling blinked and went out, leaving only a faint morning ray of light coming from the same small window under the ceiling. Some small specks of dust roamed in the ray of light. This ray of light was right in front of some figure that stood in the shade in the far corner of the room. The criminal stopped, peering at the figure. Kurt recognized this silhouette from thousands of similar ones. It was his mother. While the realization of this slowly rolled in his mind, her ghostly silhouette approached the kidnapper with sharp, jerky movements. The air was filled with electricity. The objects around lively twitched. Surprised, the heavyweight dropped the chainsaw. It apparently did not have an automatic chain brake in it. Continuing to work, slid along the floor to Kurt's feet. The ghost of his mother reached out to the bully's head and put her hands on his temples. His mouth opened. It seemed he was immersed in some kind of trance. The ghost turned his head to Kurt and said, "Farewell, I love you," after which he began to melt. Kurt realized that he had only a few seconds to save his life. He jerked his arms down, realizing that he could not saw off the handcuffs. He pressed the chainsaw with his foot so that it would cut off his hand. Kurt jerked his hand sharply. There was no pain, but blood flooded the floor. Kurt grabbed the chainsaw with his undamaged hand. It was damn uncomfortable and heavy. Handcuffs with his hand stuck in them dangled on his arm. The ghost disappeared, the lamp on the ceiling lit up again. The heavyweight seemed to be drugged, and he only managed to turn his head towards Kurt. A grimace of all-consuming malice froze on his face. Kurt, as best he could, through pain and despair, helping himself with his wounded hand, leaned on his kidnapper with a chainsaw. He let out a piercing scream. The chainsaw got stuck in him and stopped. The carcass of the big guy fell to the floor. Breathing quickly and convulsively, Kurt rushed to bandage his wound. After a couple of minutes of frantic searching, he found a first aid kit, or rather a case for tools, filled with various drugs. There he found both painkillers and coagulants. His experience in the Austrian pioneer organization, something like the Boy Scouts, saved him. 20 minutes later, he was already driving a car, which he found in the garage, to the hospital, along with his laptop and hand in a bag. Despite the fact that he managed to escape, Kurt realized that this was not yet the end of the situation. He was lucky in the hospital an excellent surgeon was on duty and Kurt's hand was sewn on with a relatively optimistic prognosis. Coming out of anesthesia, Kurt first asked for a phone call. His mother did not answer the phone, although for her it was a common thing, which, by the way, sometimes annoyed Kurt a little, but not this time. Despite the fact that Kurt was an atheist, this time he prayed and continued to call. The phone was picked up. "Mom, Mom!" Kurt shouted into the microphone. There was silence on the other end, only someone's quiet crying was heard. "Hello, son?" Kurt's father answered. "Mom is dead." Kurt froze, tears filled his eyes so that he could not see anything. His voice broke, he barely managed to ask, "How? What happened?" "About 2 hours ago, we were already asleep. Suddenly she got up. It was so strange. She didn't say anything, didn't answer questions, just went out into the corridor where our photos hang, took yours, your first year in college." She pressed it to her chest and seemed to look somewhere into the distance, and then she just fell. Kurt's father held back tears. He was just experiencing the depth of loss. Bitterness was felt in every his word. "Nevertheless," he continued, "she was so worried about you. Yesterday she was on pins and needles all day, very worried, said that she thinks that you have problems." "How are you? How was the date?" "I'll tell you later. Now we need to take care of Mom," Kurt replied, but he did not recognize his own voice. It was dull, low, and trembling. His father agreed and told Kurt that he was waiting for the funeral service team any minute and he still had to prepare something. They said goodbye and Kurt hung up. His mother died at the very moment when her ghost saved his life. A feeling of complete emptiness and a soul burned to the ground overwhelmed Kurt. He looked in the mirror, which was in the ward, and hardly recognized himself. The reflection in the mirror was 50 years old, no less. Kurt looked aged and emaciated. Kurt started calling his work. Now it was necessary to urgently secure the servers. Whoever his kidnappers were, they clearly have a backup plan, and Kurt is obliged to warn the security service so that they also use the resources of the police through their channels. At the very beginning of their communication, the investigators were skeptical about Kurt's story. They were sure that he was just high with some sick girlfriend and cut off his hand himself. If it weren't for the widow of the missing security officer, who turned out to be the daughter of some important person from Washington, there might not have been a case. But together with the management of the company, they managed to put pressure on the police management and the investigation began. After a couple of hours, a statement about the disappearance of a neighbor was added, that grandfather whom Kurt asked to call 911. Given the complexity of the situation, as soon as Kurt was able to stand and move on his own, the investigators took him to that house. But they only found an old abandoned house. No traces of presence, no bodies, no blood, no single button or cigarette butt. Considering that Kurt cut off his hand in this house, it was suspicious, although the investigators doubted whether it was the house at all. Maybe Kurt again just got high. Kurt limped around the house, showing where and what happened. Scratches from the handcuffs in which Kurt was found on the pipe and microparticles of his clothes on the fence. In the basement, he felt a strange feeling. He stood opposite the place where he saw his mother for the last time, and it seemed to him that he felt her invisible and barely perceptible presence. Kurt whispered, forgive me for everything." A tear rolled down his cheek. The investigator who was with him took it differently. Okay, let's get out of here. You shouldn't stay here for long. If you need a psychologist contact, I can give it if you don't have your own. Kurt was driving a taxi to his home. The whole surrounding world seemed unreal to him, too contrived. He saw smiling people on the streets who don't even realize what horrors can hide behind the next fence. These people just live in their soap bubbles, enchanted by the iridescence of colors of their fragile sphere, but just one light touch of evil and all this can come to an end, no matter how decent, hardworking, law-abiding and good person you are. You can do everything right and still lose. This is not justice, this is just the cruel truth of life. Coming home, he opened his laptop, ran a virus scan and opened the browser, which automatically loaded the latest tabs. One of them was a tab with a dating site. A painfully familiar sound rang out. Kurt twitched with disgust. It was a new message from some unfamiliar girl. Kurt slammed the laptop shut, fell to the floor and cried. As a messenger from the past, which cannot be changed, yesterday's pancake, which he forgot to put in the refrigerator, lay lonely on a plate.